Have you ever wondered why some elderly people seem to live their best life, even in their later years? What is their secret to happiness and peace? In today's video, we're diving into the timeless wisdom of those who have been through it all. We'll explore 7 things you should let go of in old age to truly embrace peace, joy, and a fulfilling life. Through the personal stories of wise elderly individuals, you'll discover life-changing advice that can help you navigate your golden years with grace and happiness. So, stick around for the wisdom that can make your golden years even more beautiful. 1. Let go of regrets. The story of Mrs. Lilly. Mrs. Lilly, now 84, spent much of her life carrying around the heavy burden of regret. As a young woman, she had always dreamed of becoming an artist. She had a natural talent for painting, but life's responsibilities, marriage, raising children, and working full-time, led her to put those dreams aside. For years, Mrs. Lilly couldn't help but feel guilty whenever she looked at her old sketchbooks and unfinished canvases, wondering what could have been if she had just followed her passion. The thought of "what if" haunted her. But everything changed one afternoon when Mrs. Lilly sat down with her old friend Margaret. They talked about life, their children, and the memories they had built together. During the conversation, Mrs. Lilly shared her regrets about never pursuing her art career. Margaret listened patiently, then gently reminded her, "Lilly, you've had such a full life. You raised a beautiful family, and you've made a difference in the lives of so many people. Why hold on to something you can't change?" It was in that moment that Mrs. Lilly had an epiphany. She realized that she had spent so many years grieving the past and worrying over missed opportunities that she had forgotten to appreciate the present. She had a wealth of beautiful experiences, friendships, and accomplishments that brought her joy. With Margaret's encouragement, Mrs. Lilly decided to forgive herself for the things she couldn't change and begin focusing on what she still could, living fully in the moment and finding happiness in her current life. Her advice now, after all these years, is simple but powerful. Don't hold on to things you can't change. Instead, focus on the joy of what you've already accomplished and enjoy the present. Mrs. Lilly started painting again, but this time without the pressure of trying to turn it into a career. She paints because it makes her happy, because it's something she can do for herself, free from regret. The takeaway here is clear. Forgiveness is a powerful tool, especially when it comes to forgiving ourselves. Regret can weigh us down, but living in the moment and embracing what we have now can lighten our hearts. Mrs. Lilly's story reminds us that it's never too late to let go of what could have been and focus on the beauty of the life we're living today. 2. Let go of the need to please others. The story of Mr. James. Mr. James, 77, spent much of his life going out of his way to make others happy. Whether it was his family, friends, or co-workers, he was always the one who would drop everything to help, often sacrificing his own well-being in the process. For years, he thought that by putting others' needs first, he would earn their approval and create lasting happiness. However, what he didn't realize was that constantly trying to please everyone left him feeling drained, unfulfilled, and resentful. It wasn't until one evening when he sat down with his daughter, Sarah, that he finally had an eye-opening conversation about the toll it was taking on him. He had been staying up late to help a friend with a project, even though he was exhausted. Sarah gently asked him, "Dad, why do you keep doing this? You've already done so much for others. When do you start doing things for yourself?" It was in that moment that Mr. James realized how much he had neglected his own needs and desires in favor of others. After that conversation, Mr. James began to reflect on the years he had spent prioritizing others at the cost of his own happiness. He realized that by constantly trying to meet everyone else's expectations, he had lost sight of his own desires and well-being. It was a revelation that changed his approach to life. He started saying no to requests that didn't align with his values or drained his energy. And, most importantly, he gave himself permission to put himself first, without guilt. Now, Mr. James often shares this advice. You have the right to say no and put yourself first. Life is too short to live by others' expectations. He learned that it's not selfish to set boundaries. In fact, it's necessary for maintaining peace and happiness in one's own life. The takeaway here is invaluable. Setting boundaries is not only a form of self-care, but it's also a way to protect your peace. You don't have to constantly meet others' demands, especially if it comes at the cost of your own well-being. By letting go of the need to please others, you can reclaim your time, your energy, and ultimately, your happiness. Mr. James' story is a reminder that you deserve to live life on your own terms, free from the weight of external expectations. 3. Let go of clutter. The story of Mrs. Doris. Mrs. Doris, 79, had spent much of her life collecting things. She believed that the more possessions she had, the more comfortable and secure she would feel. Over the years, her house became filled with souvenirs, old furniture, clothes she never wore, and mementos from every stage of her life. She thought that keeping all these items around would bring her joy and a sense of stability. But instead, it only created a sense of overwhelm and chaos in her home. It wasn't until Mrs. Doris decided to downsize and move to a smaller house that she realized just how much her clutter had been holding her back. The process of packing up years of accumulated belongings was emotionally challenging, but it also forced her to confront what was truly important to her. As she went through each box, she asked herself, "Do I really need this? Is this adding value to my life?" It was a moment of clarity that changed everything. She began letting go of items that no longer served her, and with each thing she released, she felt a sense of lightness and freedom. In her new, smaller home, Mrs. Doris found that she not only had more space, but her mind felt clearer as well. She was no longer weighed down by the clutter that had surrounded her for so long. Declutter your space, and you'll declutter your mind, she says now. Letting go of the excess baggage, both physical and emotional, allowed her to focus on what truly mattered. She discovered that she could find comfort and peace without being surrounded by things she didn't need. The takeaway here is profound. Letting go of material possessions can lead to mental and emotional clarity. By decluttering your physical space, you create room for more joy, peace, and freedom in your life. Mrs. Doris's story teaches us that we don't need to hold on to things just because we've had them for years. Letting go of the old can open up space for new experiences and a clearer, more peaceful mind. 4. Let go of holding grudges. The story of Mr. Walter. Mr. Walter, 85, had carried a heavy grudge against his brother for years. It all started with a family disagreement that escalated into a bitter feud. The two brothers had been close growing up, but a misunderstanding over an inheritance tore them apart. Mr. Walter couldn't forgive his brother for what he saw as a betrayal, and over time, that resentment festered, causing emotional and physical strain. He often found himself replaying the argument in his mind, each time growing angrier and more resentful. One afternoon, while sitting with his daughter Emily, the topic came up. She gently asked him, "Dad, do you really want to keep carrying this weight? Holding on to this anger? It's hurting you more than it's hurting him." At first, Mr. Walter couldn't understand what she meant. His grudge had been a part of him for so long that he didn't realize how much it was affecting his health and his happiness. But as he sat there thinking, it hit him. All these years of anger had only taken a toll on him, not on his brother. His brother had moved on, but Mr. Walter had been stuck, holding on to the bitterness. That conversation marked a turning point for Mr. Walter. He realized that holding on to the grudge was like carrying a heavy, unnecessary burden. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to forget, but it does mean you release the burden of anger and move on, he now advises others. Letting go of his resentment didn't mean he had to reconcile with his brother immediately or forget the past, but it did mean freeing himself from the grip of anger. With time, Mr. Walter reached out to his brother, and while they didn't become best friends again, he found peace in letting go of the hatred. The takeaway here is clear. Forgiveness is not just about making amends with others, but about giving yourself the gift of inner peace. Holding grudges takes a toll on your mental and physical health. By forgiving, you release yourself from that burden, which allows for better health, happiness, and emotional freedom. Mr. Walter's story teaches us that holding on to anger only harms ourselves, and that forgiveness can bring the peace and healing we all deserve. 5. Let go of fears of aging. The story of Mrs. Margaret. Mrs. Margaret, 80, used to be terrified of the aging process. In her younger years, she feared that growing older meant losing her beauty, her vitality, and her place in the world. She'd look in the mirror and cringe at her gray hair and wrinkles, wishing she could turn back time. For years, the fear of aging consumed her, and she tried everything from creams to treatments in an effort to keep time at bay. But despite her best efforts, the inevitable continued. Her body changed, and so did her mindset. The turning point came one day when Mrs. Margaret attended a family gathering. She watched as her children and grandchildren embraced her with warmth and admiration, not for her youth, but for the wisdom and experience she had gathered over the years. As she laughed with her loved ones, she realized that her gray hair and wrinkles weren't signs of decay. They were symbols of the life she had lived, the lessons she had learned, and the resilience she had shown. Instead of feeling embarrassed by the physical changes, she began to embrace them with pride. Aging is not something to fear, it's something to embrace, she now tells everyone who will listen. Mrs. Margaret's transformation was profound. She no longer spent time fearing the future. Instead, she reveled in the present. She saw aging not as a curse, but as a gift, a chance to share her wisdom, enjoy her experiences, and help others who were just beginning their own journeys. Embrace aging with pride. It's a gift, not something to fear, she advises, reminding us that the wrinkles and silver strands tell the story of a life well lived. The takeaway here is powerful. Aging is a natural part of life, and it brings with it wisdom, confidence, and strength. Instead of dreading the passage of time, we should embrace it with pride. Each year is a new opportunity to grow, to teach, and to appreciate the incredible journey we're on. Mrs. Margaret's story teaches us that aging is something to celebrate, not fear, and that the true beauty of life comes from accepting ourselves as we are. 6. Let go of the desire to control everything. The story of Mr. Arthur. Mr. Arthur, 78, had always been a perfectionist. For as long as he could remember, he prided himself on being in control of every situation. From his home to his work and even his daily routines, everything had to be done in a specific way. He believed that if he could just manage every detail, he could avoid problems and ensure success in all areas of life. However, it wasn't until Mr. Arthur faced a series of health challenges that he realized just how impossible this mindset was to maintain. After a major health scare, Mr. Arthur was forced to slow down. For the first time in his life, he had to accept that his body wasn't going to respond to commands the way it used to. Tasks that he once took for granted, like climbing stairs or even walking long distances, became challenges. He found himself growing frustrated, trying to plan every part of his day down to the minute, only to have his body resist him. It wasn't until a conversation with an old friend that the truth hit him. "You don't have to control everything," his friend told him. "Life has its own rhythm. Sometimes you have to let go and just let things unfold." That conversation changed Mr. Arthur's outlook on life. He realized that despite his best efforts, he couldn't control every little thing, especially when it came to his health. He began to find peace in accepting the unpredictability of life. Instead of trying to micromanage every aspect, he learned to let go of the need for perfection. He discovered that peace came from accepting life as it comes, even when things didn't go according to plan. The takeaway here is a valuable one. Releasing the need for control can lead to greater peace and freedom. Life doesn't always go the way we want, and sometimes that's okay. By letting go of the desire to control everything, we open ourselves to a more relaxed, more fulfilling existence. Mr. Arthur's story teaches us that, in the end, we're better off accepting life's natural flow and finding peace in the moments we can't control. 7. Let go of negative thinking. The story of Mrs. Betty. Mrs. Betty, 82, spent much of her life focusing on what was wrong. She often found herself dwelling on the negative aspects of her days, the aches and pains that came with aging, the things she couldn't do anymore, and the losses she'd experienced. Over time, this negative thinking became a habit, and she found herself feeling stuck in a cycle of complaints and worries. It wasn't until she joined a local community group that everything began to change. The group focused on gratitude and positive thinking, and Mrs. Betty was hesitant at first, thinking it was just another fleeting trend. But as the weeks went by, she realized how much of a difference shifting her mindset could make. At one of the group meetings, the facilitator asked everyone to share one thing they were grateful for that week. Mrs. Betty hesitated, struggling to think of anything positive to share. But as she listened to others express their gratitude for small things, like a kind gesture from a neighbor or the beauty of a sunny day, she felt a shift in her heart. She started to reframe her own thoughts, focusing on the things that brought her joy instead of constantly thinking about what was wrong. Slowly but surely, Mrs. Betty began to notice a change in how she felt. Her days no longer seemed as overwhelming, and she found herself more energized and hopeful. Your mind is powerful. If you focus on the positive, the world will seem brighter. Mrs. Betty now shares with everyone she meets. She no longer spends her time lamenting what she can't do, but instead she fills her days with gratitude for the blessings she has. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but over time, she learned that by focusing on the good, her whole outlook on life improved. The takeaway here is simple but profound. Replace negative thoughts with gratitude and optimism, and you'll find that life becomes much more fulfilling. Mrs. Betty's story teaches us that the way we think shapes the way we feel and experience the world. By consciously choosing gratitude over complaints, we can create a more joyful and peaceful existence, no matter our age. Conclusion. As we've seen through these inspiring stories, letting go of regrets, the need to please others, clutter, grudges, fears, control, and negative thinking can bring incredible peace and happiness in our later years. Remember, it's never too late to embrace these changes and live a more fulfilling life. Thank you so much for watching. If you found these stories helpful, don't forget to leave a comment with a 9 if you're ready to let go of the past, or a 0 if you're embracing a new mindset today. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take care, and see you in the next video.